Cruelty always finds its mirror eventually. On courthouse steps slick with Seattle rain, Maya Serrano learned that mockery carves deeper wounds in those who wield it than in those who endure it. The homeless man beneath the arch, shivering, silent, dismissed, was Elias Grant, heir to an empire these teenagers couldn't fathom. When limousines choked the street hours later, dignity rose from cardboard like smoke from embers. Maya's laughter died in her throat, replaced by a truth that would haunt her. They mocked the homeless man on the steps. Hours later, his family's limousines blocked the street. Became the story of how she discovered herself in the act of destroying another. Subscribe to witness how revelation burns. The rain arrived in Seattle the way it always did, not as drama, but as inevitability, a grey curtain descending over the city with the patience of something that knew it would never be refused. Maya Serrano felt the mist settle on her leather jacket, tiny diamonds of moisture catching in the expensive weave, and she pulled her collar higher against the November cold that seeped through Pioneer Square like a living thing. The courthouse loomed behind her, all neoclassical columns and the weight of judgment, its architecture speaking of order and consequence in a language she'd never bothered to learn. Beside her, Jordan Pike scrolled through his phone with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never questioned whether the world would wait for his attention, his other hand buried in the pocket of a coat that cost more than some families spent on rent. The street exhaled exhaust and dampness, bus brakes hissing in the distance, the scent of espresso drifting from a nearby cafe, mixing with the metallic tang of wet pavement. They were 17 and 18, respectively, wrapped in the invisible armor of privilege that made them believe the world's sharp edges would never find their skin. The man beneath the courthouse arch had become part of the architecture in their eyes, just another fixture of urban decay, as unremarkable as the bronze statues or the weathered stone. Elias Grant sat with his back against the cold pillar, cardboard pressed against his shoulders like a parody of insulation. His form hunched into itself in that particular way homeless bodies learn to fold, making themselves smaller, less offensive to the gaze of those who preferred not to see. His coat was the color of old blood and forgotten things, patched at the elbows with fabric that didn't quite match. And his hands, large, weathered, lined with stories he'd stopped telling, clutched a paper cup that might once have held something warm. The rain hadn't spared him. Water darkened the cardboard at his back, dripped from the brim of a wool cap, pulled low over eyes that looked at everything and nothing simultaneously, and his breath emerged in small clouds that dissipated before they could become anything substantial. Maya glanced at him the way she might glance at a discarded newspaper, her gaze sliding over him without purchase, without recognition that what sat there was fully human in all the ways that mattered. Around them, the city moved with purposeful indifference, briefcases and umbrellas, hurried steps and averted eyes, everyone participating in the collective agreement that suffering observed too closely became a demand for response. Jordan noticed her looking, and something shifted in his expression. That particular cruelty teenagers cultivate when they need to prove their sophistication, when kindness seems like weakness and mockery becomes currency among their peers. "Check out the 5-star accommodations," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry, but with plausible deniability built in. That tone that could retreat into just joking if challenged. Maya felt something flicker in her chest, a small warning light her conscience tried to illuminate. But the pressure to align with Jordan, to prove she was cool enough, detached enough, above sentiment, pressed down harder than any moral whisper. She laughed, the sound sharp and bright against the grey afternoon. And the man beneath the arch didn't move, didn't acknowledge, simply continued existing in whatever internal space he'd retreated to when the world decided he didn't matter. The courthouse steps stretched before them, worn smooth by decades of feet carrying their problems to judgment, and Maya descended 2 steps to stand closer to Jordan, her expensive sneakers finding purchase on stone that had witnessed infinitely more consequential moments than this casual cruelty. She was performing now, building the narrative of herself as someone unbothered by suffering, someone whose comfort insulated her from the messiness of compassion. Probably has better health care than us, with all the emergency room visits, Maya continued, the words tumbling out before she could consider their weight, before she could recognize that she was constructing her identity through demolition, building herself up by pushing another down. Jordan's grin widened, encouraged, and he glanced at the man with exaggerated appraisal, his eyes never quite landing, never quite seeing beyond the costume of poverty to the person beneath. The November wind picked up, carrying the scent of Puget Sound, salt and decay, and the promise of storms building over water. And somewhere, a car alarm began its mechanical wailing, adding to the urban symphony of disconnection. Elias Grant shifted slightly, his cardboard crinkling, and Maya caught a glimpse of his face beneath the cap's shadow, lined deeply, skin weathered to leather by exposure, but the structure underneath suggesting something aristocratic, bones that spoke of lineage, even when everything else spoke of abandonment. She looked away quickly, not wanting to see anything that might complicate her narrative, not wanting the homeless man to become dimensional, to acquire the specificity that would make mockery into something uglier than she was prepared to acknowledge. The courthouse behind them held court in its own silence, windows reflecting clouds that moved with ponderous dignity, and Maya felt suddenly very young, standing on those steps with her leather jacket and her learned cruelty, playing at sophistication while the city's real dramas unfolded in spaces she'd never have the courage to enter. Jordan pulled out his phone again, angling it toward the man beneath the arch, not quite taking a photo, but making the threat of it visible, weaponizing documentation the way their generation had learned to do, turning moments into content, suffering into entertainment. Should I get a selfie? Blessed life and all that. His tone carried irony so thick it became its own kind of sincerity, the joke containing its own belief system, and Maya felt her stomach tighten even as she forced another laugh. The man's hands tightened slightly around his paper cup, the only indication he was aware of them, that their performance was landing on ears that could hear, on a consciousness that was processing their cruelty, even if it chose not to respond. Around them, other pedestrians flowed past like water around stones, their gazes sliding away with practiced efficiency, everyone complicit in the agreement that what they didn't acknowledge didn't demand their energy. Maya wondered, in the small space behind her performed indifference, what it felt like to be so thoroughly unseen, to sit in public space, rendered invisible by consensus, your humanity edited out of other people's narratives before you could even introduce yourself. The thought lasted only a moment before she pushed it away, uncomfortable with the empathy trying to crack her shell, desperate to maintain the distance that made mockery possible, that kept the world sorted into categories that made sense, people who mattered and people who were simply there, backdrop to the real story, extras in someone else's movie. The cold deepened as afternoon began its slide toward evening, the light going grey and then greyer, shadows stretching from the courthouse columns like dark fingers reaching across the square. Maya checked her phone. Her mother would be expecting her home soon. Dinner would be warming in their kitchen with its granite counters and stainless appliances, her room waiting with its curated comfort and the illusion that the world was essentially fair, essentially safe, if you just made the right choices. Jordan was texting someone, his attention fracturing, and Maya felt the moment losing its intensity, the performance winding down without the audience's continued engagement. She glanced one more time at the man beneath the arch, Elias Grant, whose name she didn't know, whose story she'd never asked for, whose presence she'd reduced to punchline and prop in the small drama of her own self-construction. He was looking up now, not at her directly, but at the street beyond them, at something she couldn't see, and for a fraction of a second their eyes met. His dark and unreadable, carrying depth she couldn't fathom, and hers wide and young and frightened suddenly by what she'd become capable of so casually. Then the moment broke. Jordan was pulling her arm, saying something about getting coffee before heading home, and Maya let herself be pulled away, back into the current of her privileged life, leaving the man beneath the arch to his cardboard and his silence, never imagining that in a few hours the street would fill with engines and revelation, and everything she thought she knew about power and powerlessness would shatter like glass hitting pavement. The cafe 3 blocks from the courthouse smelled of burned espresso and wet wool, steam rising from the industrial machine behind the counter, where a barista with sleeve tattoos worked with the focused intensity of someone performing a ritual. Maya and Jordan claimed a corner table near the rain-streaked window, their jackets draped over chairs, phones placed face-up on the scarred wood surface like talismans against boredom or genuine connection. The warmth hit Maya's cold, numbed face like a physical thing, her cheeks tingling as circulation returned, and she wrapped her hands around the paper cup of chai Jordan had bought without asking what she wanted. His assumption of her preferences, one more small assertion of how well he believed he knew her. Outside, the city continued its grey procession, umbrellas blooming like dark flowers, bus exhaust mixing with fog, the perpetual Seattle wetness that made everything look softer than it was, blurred at the edges. Maya took a sip and found the chai too sweet, cloyingly spiced. But she didn't say anything, because correcting Jordan felt like more work than simply enduring the wrong drink, and wasn't that its own small surrender, its own erasure of preference in service to maintaining ease? Jordan was scrolling through social media with the half-attention teenagers gave to most things, his thumb moving in practiced swipes, occasionally pausing to double-tap a like into existence or craft a comment designed to showcase his wit. "Emma's at that gallery opening downtown," he said without looking up, his voice carrying the particular flatness that meant he was narrating the lives of people they knew without being genuinely interested, filling silence because silence felt like failure. Maya made a non-committal sound, her own attention drifting to the window where rain now fell with more commitment, transforming mist into actual weather. Droplets racing each other down the glass in patterns that seemed meaningful until you tried to trace them. She thought about the man on the courthouse steps. Elias, though she didn't know his name yet, couldn't have imagined the weight that name carried in circles, far above her family's comfortable but unremarkable station. The image of him, hunched beneath that arch, kept returning like a photograph she couldn't delete, and with it came a discomfort she couldn't quite name, a sense that she'd participated in something that diminished her rather than elevated her, despite Jordan's approving laughter, despite the momentary thrill of cruelty's sharp pleasure. The cafe's warmth suddenly felt oppressive, the smell of coffee too rich, and Maya pushed her chai away with a small sound of dissatisfaction that Jordan didn't notice, his attention still captured by the small screen that contained entire universes he'd rather inhabit than this moment, this conversation, this girl sitting across from him who was beginning to suspect that everything about their friendship was performance rather than substance. "You know what's crazy?" Jordan said suddenly, looking up with that expression he got when he was about to share an insight he considered profound, his eyes bright with the particular excitement of someone who believed their observations were unique. Like, how did that guy even end up there? What series of bad decisions do you have to make to wind up on courthouse steps in November? His question hung in the air between them, structured to sound philosophical, but really just another way of reinforcing the distance between them and the suffering they'd witnessed. Another method of sorting the world into those who deserved comfort and those whose discomfort was somehow earned. Maya felt something tighten in her throat. Not quite disagreement, but not endorsement either. A space opening inside her where certainty used to live. She knew the answer Jordan expected, the response that would keep their dynamic smooth, would affirm the worldview they'd been raised to accept, that poverty was ultimately a choice, that suffering stemmed from failure, that their privilege was simply the natural result of their family's better decisions, harder work, superior values. But the words wouldn't come, stuck somewhere between her brain and her tongue, and instead she found herself saying, "Maybe it's not about decisions. Maybe it's about what happens to you." The statement landed awkwardly, disrupting the script they usually followed, and Jordan's expression flickered with something. Confusion, maybe, or mild irritation at having his narrative challenged. "I mean, yeah, bad luck and whatever," he said with the dismissive tone of someone conceding a point they didn't actually believe. "But ultimately, you're responsible for your own life, right? Nobody ends up like that without making serious mistakes." He was leaning back now, defensive, his body language closing, and Maya recognized the signs that she'd violated some unspoken agreement about the boundaries of their conversation, the acceptable range of opinions she was permitted to hold. The cafe continued its business around them, the hiss of steam, the clink of cups, low conversations forming a blanket of ambient sound, and Maya felt suddenly isolated despite Jordan's physical presence, despite the warmth and the people and the sense of being inside while the rain fell outside. She'd spent so much of her adolescence learning to mirror the opinions of whoever she was with, becoming a social chameleon who changed color to match her environment, and now that instinct warred with something newer, rawer, a small voice insisting that agreement wasn't the same as truth, that maintaining comfort wasn't the same as maintaining integrity. But the new voice was weak, unpracticed, easily shouted down by the older instinct for social survival, and so Maya nodded slightly. Let the conversation drift to safer territory. Let Jordan interpret her silence as assent, while inside her something began the slow, painful work of questioning everything she'd been taught about deserving and undeserving, about who mattered and who didn't. Jordan's phone buzzed, and his attention evaporated completely, his fingers moving across the screen with the unconscious fluency of a native language, and Maya found herself studying him as if from a great distance. The expensive haircut that looked deliberately careless, the designer sweatshirt that cost more than the barista probably made in a week, the easy confidence of someone who'd never had to question whether the world would catch him if he fell. They'd known each other since middle school, had moved through the same social circles like planets in synchronized orbit, and Maya realized with sudden clarity that she'd never actually chosen him as a friend, so much as accepted the inevitability of their connection. The way people living in adjacent neighborhoods became familiar through proximity rather than genuine affinity. What did she even like about Jordan? What connected them beyond shared geography and similar tax brackets? The questions felt dangerous, disloyal, and Maya shoved them away, unwilling to examine the architecture of her life too closely, afraid of what she might find if she started pulling at threads. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the window with insistent rhythm, and a man ran past with a newspaper held ineffectively over his head, his dress shoes splashing through puddles, briefcase banging against his leg. Maya watched him disappear around the corner and wondered if he had somewhere warm to go, someone waiting for him, or if the rain followed people all the way home, finding cracks in whatever shelter they'd constructed. "My dad's firm is handling this huge merger," Jordan said abruptly, the non sequitur typical of his conversational style, thoughts emerging without connection to what came before. Like billions of dollars, super high profile. He's been working crazy hours, but he says when it closes, he's taking us to Maui for 2 weeks. His voice carried pride and complaint in equal measure. the particular tone of someone whose parents' absence was cushioned by material compensation, whose neglect came wrapped in luxury. Maya made an appropriately impressed sound, the trained response emerging without thought, but internally she was calculating the cost of 2 weeks in Maui, comparing it to the paper cup the man on the steps had clutched, the cardboard he'd pressed against courthouse stone. The disparity felt obscene suddenly, not in the political sense. Maya had no developed political consciousness, no framework for understanding inequality beyond vague notions absorbed from whichever adults happened to be speaking, but in some more visceral way, a gut-level response to the sheer distance between Jordan's casual vacation planning and the man's struggle for basic warmth. How did these two realities exist simultaneously? How did the world hold both without tearing apart from the contradiction? Maya felt dizzy with the question, her chai-sweetened tongue thick in her mouth, her comfortable cafe chair suddenly an accusation rather than a refuge. Jordan kept talking, something about hotels and snorkeling and whether they'd rent jet skis, his voice washing over Maya like rain on glass. Audible but not penetrating, present but not meaningful. She nodded at intervals, maintained the performance of attention while her actual consciousness drifted back to Pioneer Square, to the courthouse steps, to the moment when she'd laughed at suffering and felt momentarily elevated by her own cruelty. The shame arrived slowly, not all at once, but seeping in like water through cardboard, and with it came a realization that felt too large for the cafe, too unwieldy for her 17-year-old understanding. That maybe the worst thing about what she'd done wasn't the mockery itself, but how easy it had been, how natural, how little resistance she'd felt before letting cruelty slip from her tongue like casual conversation. What did that ease reveal about who she was beneath the performed kindness, beneath the smile she'd cultivated for teachers and parents and college applications? The rain against the window intensified into a roar, and Maya felt the sound inside her chest, a pressure building, and she understood with sudden certainty that something had begun on those courthouse steps that couldn't be taken back, that innocence, once punctured, couldn't be reinflated, that she would carry this moment forward into whatever person she was becoming. And the weight of it, of knowing what she was capable of recognizing the casual monster that lived beneath her nice girl surface, felt heavier than any rain-soaked cardboard, more permanent than any November cold. The rain had settled into that steady Seattle persistence by the time Maya left the cafe. Jordan, heading toward his car, parked in a garage that charged more per hour than minimum wage earned, while she opted to walk the 15 blocks home, needing movement, needing the cold to clarify something that felt muddy and urgent inside her skull. The streets gleamed with reflected neon and headlights, the city taking on that particular beauty. Rain gave it. All surfaces doubled. The world above and the world mirrored below, creating an architecture of light and water that transformed ordinary blocks into something almost magical. Maya pulled her hood up and started walking north, her expensive sneakers squeaking against wet pavement, each step sending small splashes up her ankles where her jeans ended and exposed skin began. Around her, Seattle moved through its evening rhythms, restaurants beginning to fill with the after-work crowd, shops closing their doors with the decisive click of locks engaging, buses sighing to stops where clusters of people waited with the patient exhaustion of those whose day had been long and whose home was still not close enough. Maya wove through the pedestrian traffic, her phone heavy in her pocket, though she didn't pull it out, suddenly reluctant to engage with the constant stream of content and connection, wanting instead to be alone with the uncomfortable thoughts Jordan's presence had kept at bay. 3 blocks from the cafe, she passed another figure in a doorway, not sleeping, but sitting with the alert stillness of someone waiting for something that might not come. A woman, this time, younger than the man on the courthouse steps, but with that same quality of being simultaneously hypervisible and utterly unseen. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and Maya felt the woman's gaze like a physical thing, not pleading or accusing, but simply present, witnessing, acknowledging that Maya was there, even if Maya wanted to pretend otherwise. Maya looked away quickly, her pace accelerating, heart rate climbing with a panic that seemed disproportionate to the encounter, but which she couldn't control, couldn't reason away. What was she afraid of? That the woman would ask for something, that witnessing would become obligation, that if she looked too long, she'd have to acknowledge the mathematical impossibility of the city, the way it contained multitudes of suffering alongside multitudes of indifference, and that she was firmly, irreversibly on the side of the indifferent. The rain drummed against her hood, and Maya counted her steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. A meditation technique some wellness app had taught her, a way to bring consciousness back to the present moment. Though the present moment was precisely what she was trying to escape, the weight of all those gazes she'd avoided, all those opportunities for compassion she'd transformed into opportunities for disconnection. Her route home took her past the courthouse again, though she hadn't consciously planned it, her feet finding familiar paths while her mind wandered through its uncomfortable territory. The square was darker now, streetlights casting pools of amber illumination that made everything beyond their reach seem even more shadowed by contrast, and Maya found herself slowing as she approached, her eyes searching for the arch, for the man who'd been there hours ago when she'd stood beside Jordan and made cruelty into entertainment. The space beneath the arch was empty now. The cardboard gone, the paper cup vanished. No sign that anyone had occupied that cold stone, except maybe a darker patch where rain hadn't quite reached. Maya felt an odd deflation, a disappointment that surprised her with its intensity. Had she wanted him to still be there? Had she been planning some kind of redemption, some gesture that would alleviate the discomfort his memory caused? Or was it simpler, just the desire to confirm he was real, that the encounter had happened, that she hadn't constructed the whole thing as some kind of moral parable her conscience had invented to torture her? The courthouse loomed above the square, its windows dark except for a few where cleaning crews moved like ghosts through empty offices, and Maya stood in the rain looking at the vacant space where suffering had been, feeling the absence as strongly as she'd felt the presence, understanding that whether he was there or not, whether she ever saw him again or not, he'd already changed something in her that couldn't be unchanged. A bus pulled up across the street, its brakes hissing, its interior lights revealing passengers in various states of exhaustion, heads leaning against windows, faces illuminated by phone screens. The particular loneliness of public transit, where bodies crowd together without any real connection forming. Maya watched people disembark, watched them disperse into the rainy evening, each carrying their private burdens and private joys into apartments and houses she'd never see, lives she'd never know, except in these brief intersections. How many stories were unfolding simultaneously across the city? How many moments of crisis and revelation and ordinary struggle? The scale of it threatened to overwhelm her. All that living happening in parallel, all those consciousnesses convinced of their own centrality, even as they played walk-on roles in everyone else's narrative. And where did that leave responsibility? If everyone was the protagonist of their own story, who was responsible for the supporting characters, the extras? The people who appeared in your frame only long enough to be mocked or dismissed or reduced to obstacle or punchline? Maya's head hurt with the thinking, her wet hair plastered to her skull beneath her hood, and she started walking again, needing motion to keep the thoughts from calcifying into something she'd have to actually deal with, rather than simply feel uncomfortable about. The neighborhoods changed as she walked. From the commercial district with its glass towers and tourist attractions to the residential blocks where actual Seattle life happened, row houses and apartment buildings, corner stores with hand-painted signs, trees growing through metal grates in the sidewalk, their bare November branches reaching toward a sky that never quite got dark in the city, just transitioned from grey to deeper grey. Maya's family lived in Queen Anne, on a street where houses cost what Jordan's father probably made in a year from that merger, where landscaping was professional and cars were new, and the general aesthetic was one of understated wealth, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because its presence was assumed. Her feet carried her up the familiar hill, her breath coming harder as the incline increased, her thighs burning pleasantly with the exertion, and she tried to calculate how far she'd walked. 5 miles? 6. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother asking where she was, and Maya responded with a brief, almost home, without explaining why she'd chosen to walk, why she needed the rain and the movement and the anonymous passage through streets where nobody knew her name or expected anything from her except to keep moving, to get out of the way, to participate in the city's perpetual flow without disrupting it. By the time she reached her street, full darkness had arrived, the kind of darkness cities never really achieved, always compromised by streetlights and porch lights and the ambient glow of windows where people were cooking dinner or watching television or having conversations Maya could only imagine. Her house sat halfway down the block, a craftsman with good bones and recent renovations, the kind of place that appeared in real estate listings as charming and move-in ready, and cost enough to make her father joke nervously about being house poor, while still affording vacations to places Jordan's family probably considered beneath them. Maya stood on the sidewalk looking at her home, the warm light spilling from windows, the smoke rising from the chimney where her mother always insisted on a fire in November, regardless of whether it was actually cold enough to justify it, the carefully maintained garden that professional hands kept beautiful in all seasons. It looked like safety. It looked like the kind of place bad things didn't reach, where suffering was kept at a comfortable distance, where the world's sharp edges were sanded down to something manageable, containable, controllable. And standing outside it, still in the rain, still carrying the weight of the courthouse steps and the empty arch and the woman in the doorway whose eyes had witnessed her, Maya understood with sudden and terrible clarity that safety was also a kind of blindness. That comfort could calcify into cruelty if you weren't careful, that the warm house waiting for her was both refuge and prison, both gift and barrier, both the thing that saved her and the thing that might ultimately damn her if she let it teach her that the world ended at her property line, that responsibility stopped at her threshold, that other people's suffering was simply the price of admission to her own comfort. Evening deepened into night, and the rain continued its Seattle constancy, transforming streets into rivers of reflected light, gutters gurgling with runoff that carried the city's accumulated detritus toward Puget Sound. Maya sat at her family's dinner table, pushing roasted chicken and vegetables around her plate, while her parents discussed their day in the coded language of married people who'd learned to communicate through shorthand and assumption, her father's voice rising and falling with stories about difficult clients and office politics, her mother offering strategic hums and questions at appropriate intervals, while simultaneously checking her own phone. The modern family dinner, a performance of togetherness that everyone participated in without fully inhabiting. Maya's mind remained elsewhere, at the courthouse, in the cafe, on the rain-slicked walk home, her consciousness operating on 2 levels simultaneously, present enough to avoid parental concern, but absent enough that she tasted nothing, registered nothing, existed in her body only minimally, while her thoughts circled the day's events like water around a drain, unable to move on, but unable to fully process, stuck in uncomfortable repetition. Maya, you're quiet tonight. Her mother observed with that particular maternal radar that detected mood shifts through frequencies inaudible to others, her fork pausing midway to her mouth, her eyes sharp with concern that hadn't yet escalated to alarm. Maya manufactured a smile, the social tool she'd perfected over years of navigating expectations, and offered something vague about being tired, about too much walking, about Jordan being Jordan in ways that made her mother's expression shift to knowing sympathy. They'd discussed Jordan before, his thoughtlessness disguised as charm, his privilege worn so casually it became invisible to him, but glaring to everyone else. Her father made a joke about teenagers and their mysterious exhaustion, and the moment passed, attention shifting elsewhere. Maya granted the privacy of her internal turmoil because nothing in her external presentation suggested crisis, suggested that something fundamental might be shifting in her understanding of who she was and what she owed the world. The chicken tasted like nothing. The vegetables might as well have been cardboard. Maya chewed and swallowed mechanically, her body performing the rituals of nourishment while her consciousness wandered Pioneer Square's darkening streets, searching for a man she'd mocked, wondering if he'd found shelter, wondering if he was cold, wondering why she cared now when she hadn't cared then, when cruelty had felt like sophistication and mockery had felt like power. After dinner, she retreated to her room, that carefully curated space of teenage identity, where posters and fairy lights and precisely arranged books all conspired to announce who she wanted people to think she was. Artistic, but not pretentious. Smart, but not nerdy. Aware of social issues, but not inconveniently radical about them. Maya lay on her bed staring at the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars formed constellations she'd stopped noticing years ago, and pulled out her phone, thumb hovering over Instagram, before deciding against the mindless scroll, the algorithm's endless feed of curated lives and performed happiness. Instead, she opened Google and typed Seattle homeless population, watching the search results populate with statistics and advocacy sites and local news stories about sweeps and encampments and the perpetual crisis that everyone acknowledged, but nobody seemed able or willing to solve. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of people without shelter on any given night, more people falling into homelessness than climbing out of it. A problem that grew despite millions spent, despite good intentions, despite the city's progressive reputation and its pockets full of tech money. Maya scrolled through articles that blurred together into a litany of systemic failure and individual suffering, her eyes catching phrases like affordable housing crisis and mental health services gap and income inequality, terms she'd heard before but never really absorbed, never let penetrate beyond abstract concept into concrete understanding that each statistic represented an actual human being with an actual story, an actual life that had somehow led to courthouse steps and cardboard, and the casual mockery of privileged teenagers who thought suffering was a choice. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jordan, a meme about something. She didn't even register what, just the assumption that they were still on the same wavelength, still operating in the same reality where shared jokes about the day's events would land with mutual understanding. Maya stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the reply field, and realized she had nothing to say to him. No language that would bridge the growing distance between wherever he was and wherever she'd arrived over the course of one rain-soaked afternoon. How did you explain to someone that you'd changed, that you couldn't pretend anymore, that the comfortable cruelty you'd shared felt suddenly intolerable? How did you articulate that you'd glimpsed something, not clarity exactly, but its opposite? A profound uncertainty about everything you'd taken for granted, about who deserved what and why, about the stories you told yourself to justify your comfort while others suffered in proximity. The meme stared back at her, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for laughter, waiting for confirmation that they were still aligned in their worldview, their values. Their casual dismissal of the uncomfortable. Maya closed the conversation without responding, a small act of rebellion that felt disproportionately significant, and returned to her Google search, to the endless articles about a problem too large to solve, but too urgent to ignore, a problem that somehow included her now, whether she wanted it to or not. Around 9 o'clock, as Maya spiraled deeper into her research rabbit hole, reading think pieces about trauma and addiction and the impossibility of pulling yourself up by bootstraps you'd never been given, her father called up the stairs that she should come see something, his voice carrying an excitement that pulled her from her room, despite her reluctance to engage with anything beyond her phone's glowing screen. She descended to find her parents at the front window, curtains pulled back, both staring at the street with expressions somewhere between confusion and curiosity. Maya joined them and felt her breath catch at the sight. The entire block choked with vehicles that didn't belong in residential Queen Anne. Black limousines and town cars forming a motorcade that stretched in both directions from their house, their polished surfaces reflecting streetlight and rain, their presence transforming the familiar street into something out of a movie, something portentous and strange. Engines idled with expensive purrs, exhaust visible in the cold air, and through tinted windows Maya could see the suggestion of figures, waiting, watching, though for what she couldn't fathom. Her mother murmured something about whether they should call the police, whether this was some kind of mistake, whether maybe it was for the neighbors, that tech executive 2 doors down who occasionally hosted parties that attracted minor celebrities and venture capitalists. But her father's face had gone still with a recognition Maya didn't understand, his hand reaching for his phone with fingers that trembled slightly, pulling up something she couldn't see from her angle. "Jesus Christ," her father breathed. The profanity shocking from a man who rarely swore, who maintained an almost comical devotion to clean language, even in moments of stress. "That's... Maya! What did you say you did today? Where did you go?" His voice carried an urgency that made her stomach clench, made her suddenly afraid, though of what she couldn't name. And she stammered something about the courthouse, about meeting Jordan, about nothing important, just hanging out, her words tumbling over each other while her mind tried to connect the limousines to her afternoon, tried to find the logic that would link expensive cars to courthouse steps, tried to understand why her father's face had gone pale and tight, why her mother's hand had gone to her throat in that gesture of unconscious distress Maya had seen only a handful of times in her life, always preceding news that would alter their reality in ways they couldn't predict or control. Outside, one of the limousine doors opened with a heavy, final sound, and a figure emerged into the rain, straight-backed despite the weather, moving with the confident precision of someone who'd never had to question whether space would be made for them, whether their presence would be accommodated. The streetlight caught his face, and Maya's world tilted sickeningly, because she knew that face, had seen it hours ago beneath a wool cap on courthouse steps, had mocked it, had laughed at it, had dismissed it as powerless, as broken, as irrelevant. And here he was, walking toward her house with a procession of wealth and consequence at his back, every step announcing that she'd been catastrophically, fundamentally wrong about everything she'd assumed, everything she'd believed about power and appearance, and who mattered in the world's invisible hierarchies. The man she'd mocked, Elias Grant. Though she still didn't know his name, still couldn't access the information that would make sense of this impossible reversal. Move through the rain as if it couldn't touch him, as if weather was something that happened to other people, his stride purposeful, his destination clear. Maya backed away from the window, her heart hammering, her mind refusing to process what her eyes insisted was real. and she heard her father's voice from very far away, saying something about the Grant family, about empire and tragedy, and a son who disappeared into street life years ago after some family rupture nobody quite understood, about how the papers had covered it, about how the whole city had speculated and whispered, and eventually moved on to newer scandals, newer mysteries. But Maya couldn't track the explanation because she was back on those courthouse steps, reliving the moment when she'd made cruelty into performance, when she'd reduced a human being to punchline, when she'd exercised the small, vicious power of mockery and felt elevated by it, and now that moment was walking toward her door, was about to knock, was about to demand an accounting she had no capacity to provide. The limousines idled in the rain, and Maya understood, with the terrible clarity of hindsight, that revelation always comes with engines purring, that truth arrives with an entourage, that the universe has a particular genius for showing you exactly who you are at the moment you're least prepared to look. The knock came precisely as Maya knew it would. 3 sharp raps that carried authority without aggression, the sound of someone accustomed to doors opening at their approach, to obstacles moving aside, to the world rearranging itself to accommodate their presence. Her father answered, while Maya and her mother stood frozen in the living room, both understanding that whatever was about to happen would alter the evening's trajectory, would pull them into a narrative they hadn't authored and couldn't control. The voice that entered first was deep and measured, carrying the particular accent of old Seattle money, not quite British but anglicized, the result of prep schools and inherited diction, words shaped by generations of assumed authority. Good evening. My name is Elias Grant. I apologize for the intrusion at this hour, but I believe your daughter and I had an encounter this afternoon that requires addressing. The formality of the language, the precision of it, hit Maya like cold water, and she emerged from the living room into the hallway where her father stood aside to reveal the man from the courthouse steps, transformed by context into someone entirely different. Same face, but animated now by dignity restored, by power reasserted, his damp coat replaced by a perfectly tailored suit, his wool cap gone to reveal silver hair combed back from a high forehead. His entire bearing announcing lineage and consequence in ways that made the courthouse arch seem like another reality entirely, like a costume he'd shrugged off to reveal the truth beneath. Maya's father stammered something about coming in, about tea or coffee, about how they were confused, about how they didn't understand. And Elias Grant stepped across the threshold with a movement that suggested this was not his first time entering homes uninvited, not his first time forcing conversations that the other party would have preferred to avoid. He moved into their living room with the ease of someone evaluating real estate, his eyes taking in the furniture and artwork with a glance that somehow managed to both appraise and dismiss, to acknowledge their middle-class comfort while simultaneously revealing it as insufficient, as quaint, as the aspirational ceiling of people who would never quite break through to where families like his lived and operated. Maya felt herself shrinking under that gaze when it finally landed on her, felt 17 and foolish and exposed in ways that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with character, with the revelation of what she'd so casually done and what it announced about who she'd become. Her mother had moved to stand protectively close, though Maya knew she didn't know why yet, didn't understand what her daughter had done to bring this strange midnight visit, this motorcade of consequence, this moment of reckoning that crackled with tension nobody could quite name, but everyone could feel settling like humidity before a storm breaks. "I should explain," Elias Grant said, lowering himself into their armchair with a movement that transformed it into a throne. His posture perfect, despite the day he'd endured, despite the cold and the mockery, and the hours on stone steps most people wouldn't let their dogs occupy. "For the past several months I've been conducting what my therapist calls radical empathy research. living as those most invisible in our city live, experiencing what my family's wealth and my own poor decisions have insulated me from understanding. This afternoon, beneath the courthouse arch, I was concluding my experiment, and your daughter, along with a young man I assume is a friend or boyfriend, provided an instructive final lesson about cruelty and class and the ease with which privilege transforms human beings into obstacles, into punchlines, into things rather than people. His voice remained even throughout this explanation, almost clinical, but beneath the measured words Maya heard rage, controlled and cold, the kind of anger that didn't need to raise its voice because it carried institutional weight, because it could destroy futures with phone calls and closed doors, because it had power that didn't need to announce itself through volume. Her father's face had gone pale and tight. Her mother's hand was at her throat again, and Maya felt tears building behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall, because crying now would be its own manipulation, its own attempt to recast herself as victim rather than perpetrator of the day's cruelty. "I'm sorry," Maya managed, the words emerging raw and insufficient, kindergarten vocabulary for a graduate-level transgression, and Elias Grant turned his full attention to her with eyes that seemed to see through skin and bone directly to the small, scared mechanism of her soul. "Sorry," he repeated, tasting the word like something spoiled. "Sorry you were caught. Sorry there were consequences. Or sorry for the action itself, because I've found in my months among the invisible that apology is often just another performance. Another way the comfortable distance themselves from discomfort without actually changing, without actually learning, without actually becoming different than they were before the apology was required." The accusation landed with surgical precision, and Maya felt something crack inside her. Some protective shell she'd carried since childhood, since the moment she'd first learned that the world sorted people into categories, and she'd been lucky enough to land in one that mattered, that counted, that got to be fully human, while others were reduced to backdrop, to statistics, to problems someone else should solve. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she wasn't really cruel, that this wasn't who she was, that it had been a moment of weakness, of following Jordan, of forgetting temporarily the values her parents had raised her with. But even forming these defenses in her mind revealed their hollowness, revealed that who you are is precisely what you do when it costs you nothing to be kind, and you choose cruelty instead when compassion would be easy and you opt for mockery, when seeing another person's humanity would require nothing but attention and you decide they're not worth looking at. Her father found his voice, attempting to mediate, to smooth over, to deploy whatever social skills middle management had taught him about conflict resolution and saving face. But Elias Grant cut him off with a gesture that carried the weight of decades, giving orders that were never questioned. "Mr. Serrano, your daughter is 17, old enough to drive, old enough to be tried as an adult for certain crimes, old enough, certainly, to understand that her actions have consequences beyond the immediate pleasure of a shared laugh with a friend. I'm not here to destroy her future, or to sue you, or to exercise the considerable power my family name still carries, despite my best efforts to distance myself from it. I'm here because transformation requires witness, requires the person who transgressed to actually see what they did, to sit with it, to metabolize it in ways that change them rather than simply making them more strategic about hiding their cruelty in the future." He paused, and in that pause Maya heard doors closing, heard opportunities evaporating, heard the future she'd imagined, college and career and the comfortable replication of her parents' life, becoming suddenly uncertain, suddenly conditional on this moment, on what she said next, on whether she could find language that would bridge the chasm between her performative kindness and her revealed capacity for casual cruelty. The limousines outside continued their expensive idling, and Maya understood that wealth was patience too. was the ability to wait while the meter ran, was never having to rush because time bent to accommodate you rather than the other way around. "I don't know how to fix this," Maya said finally, the admission of powerlessness feeling like the first honest thing she'd said all day. Maybe in weeks, maybe in years, of carefully curating herself into someone acceptable, someone liked, someone who never disrupted the smooth operation of social machinery by being too raw, too real, too willing to acknowledge the uncomfortable truths everyone conspired to ignore. "I don't know how to undo it or make it right or become different enough that I wouldn't do it again. I thought I was a good person. I thought I was kind. And then this afternoon I learned that I'm not, that I'm capable of cruelty so casual I didn't even notice I was doing it, that I can laugh at suffering and feel good about it as long as the suffering belongs to someone I've decided doesn't matter. And I hate that. I hate what I learned about myself. But hating it doesn't change it. So I don't know what you want from me, except to say that I'm sorry, in a way that's bigger than sorry usually means. Sorry, in a way that includes knowing I can't take it back, can't make it unhappen, can't restore whatever dignity I took from you when I decided your humanity wasn't worth acknowledging." The words came in a rush, unplanned, unpolished, and Maya felt her mother's hand on her shoulder, felt her father's presence beside her, felt the family unit contracting around her even as Elias Grant sat in their armchair like judgment incarnate, like consequence made flesh, like the universe's response to every casual cruelty she'd ever committed, but only this one had bothered to show up and demand accountability. Something shifted in Elias Grant's expression, not softening exactly, but recalibrating. His rage banking into something more complex, more resigned, maybe even sympathetic in the way a general might feel sympathy for enemy soldiers who were also just young and foolish and following orders they'd never thought to question. "The Grant family," he said quietly, "built its fortune on timber and real estate, on cutting down old growth and developing land, on transforming wilderness into property and selling it to people who wanted the view without the wildness. We were, though I've tried to extract myself, part of Seattle's founding machinery, the families who decided what this city would become, who would prosper, who would be displaced. And for most of my life, I lived in that legacy without questioning it, without recognizing that every luxury I enjoyed was built on someone else's loss, someone else's displacement, someone else's trees or land or home or community. It took my wife's death, my daughter's addiction, my son's estrangement, my own collapse into the very street life I'd spent decades stepping over without seeing. It took all that before I could begin to understand what I'd been blind to, what my privilege had insulated me from recognizing. He stood then, his movement slow, and Maya saw for the first time how tired he was, how the day had cost him despite the suit and the limousines and the restoration of his visible power, how living between worlds, the courthouse steps and the family estate, the cardboard and the boardrooms, had worn him down to something more essential than either identity alone could contain, had made him into a translator between realities that most people never had to reconcile, because they lived entirely in one or the other without ever crossing over. The silence after Elias Grant spoke stretched and deepened, filling the Serrano living room with a weight that made breathing feel deliberate, made existing in their bodies feel like work. Maya's mother had begun crying quietly, her hand still on Maya's shoulder, but the grip gone slack as if she'd forgotten it was there. Her tears less about the immediate situation and more about the accumulation of moments, the recognition that her daughter had reached the age where consequences lived outside parental protection, where the world could reach in and mark her in ways no amount of good intentions or careful raising could prevent. Maya's father stood with his hands in his pockets, his shoulders curved inward, looking older suddenly, looking like a man confronting the limits of his influence, his ability to fix things, his capacity to negotiate reality into a shape that spared his family discomfort. Outside, the Limousines continued their vigil, their presence transforming the suburban street into theatre, neighbours no doubt peering through curtains, phones recording or streaming, the private moment of reckoning becoming public spectacle because wealth always drew attention, always turned privacy into performance, whether those involved wanted it or not. Maya felt exposed in ways that had nothing to do with visibility, felt as if her skin had been peeled back to reveal the small, frightened mechanism beneath. The child who'd never learned to reconcile comfort with conscience, privilege with responsibility, who'd grown up in a world that taught her she mattered without ever teaching her, that mattering came with obligations, with the duty to see others as mattering equally, as deserving the same care and consideration she assumed for herself. Elias Grant moved toward the door, his purpose apparently fulfilled, his message delivered, and Maya found herself panicking at his departure because it felt unfinished, because she hadn't yet found the words that would transform this from simple shame into something approaching growth, hadn't yet articulated whatever understanding was trying to form in the space between her ribs where her heart hammered against bone. "Wait," she heard herself say, the word emerging before conscious thought, before strategy, before the social calculation that usually preceded her speech. "What do I do now? How do I become different? How do I learn to see what I've been blind to?" The questions hung in the air, naked and desperate, teenager questions asked with teenager earnestness, and Maya braced herself for dismissal, for the door closing on her plea, because she'd forfeited her right to guidance when she'd made cruelty into entertainment on courthouse steps. But Elias Grant paused with his hand on the doorknob, his back to the room, his silver hair catching light, in a way that made him look older than he probably was, more weathered by whatever journey had taken him from family estate to courthouse steps and back again. When he turned, his expression carried something unexpected, not forgiveness exactly, but recognition, the look of someone who'd asked themselves similar questions and discovered that answers didn't arrive as epiphanies, but as work, as daily practice, as the slow accumulation of choices made differently until the person who'd asked the question no longer quite existed, replaced by someone similar, but fundamentally altered by the sustained effort of attention. "You want the truth?" Elias Grant asked, his voice gentle now in a way that somehow felt more devastating than his earlier controlled rage. "There's no moment of transformation, no single realization that makes you different. You don't get to become a better person through insight alone, through feeling bad enough or understanding clearly enough. You become different by doing different, by making choices that contradict your comfort, by staying present to discomfort until discomfort teaches you something that comfort never could. You become different by going to places that scare you, by talking to people you've learned to avoid, by questioning every assumption you've inherited about who deserves what and why, by recognizing that the answer is usually not they deserve their suffering because of their choices, but the system is rigged, and I'm benefiting from that rigging whether I acknowledge it or not. He paused, studying Maya with that X-ray gaze that seemed to catalogue her every defense, every remaining delusion, every comfortable lie she still wanted to believe about herself. "You're 17. You have time to become someone else, someone better. But it won't happen through punishment or through shame, though those have their place in the process. It will happen through sustained, uncomfortable engagement with realities you've been insulated from, through relationships with people you've been taught to pity or fear or simply ignore, through the slow erosion of your certainty that the world makes sense in the way you've been told it makes sense, that people end up where they deserve to be, that suffering is always somehow earned and comfort always somehow merited. Maya absorbed this with the particular intensity of someone receiving instructions for a test they couldn't afford to fail, her mind already racing ahead to what this might mean. Volunteer work? Advocacy? Some kind of structured service that would check the boxes her conscience was suddenly demanding? But Elias Grant seemed to read her thoughts because he shook his head slightly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth that carried both sympathy and resignation. And don't make it about redemption, about earning your way back to feeling good about yourself. That's just another way of centering your comfort, your feelings, your need to be seen as one of the good ones. The work isn't about you, it's about actually seeing other people, actually caring about their well-being, independent of whether it makes you feel virtuous or evolved or sophisticated. The hardest lesson, the one I'm still learning after months of sleeping rough and years of therapy and decades of getting it wrong, is that you don't get credit for basic humanity, for treating people with dignity, for recognizing suffering and responding with compassion instead of contempt. That's just baseline. That's just the minimum requirement for participating in the human community without making it worse, without adding to the accumulated cruelty that makes the world harder than it has to be for people who already carry more than their share. He opened the door then, and November air rushed in, carrying rain and car exhaust and the complex smell of the city, and Maya felt the cold on her face like a benediction, like something clarifying, like the first breath after surfacing from underwater, where she'd been holding her breath for so long she'd forgotten she was suffocating. The limousines began moving then, their engines shifting from idle to purposeful motion, their departure as choreographed as their arrival, and Maya watched through the window as they pulled away in formation, leaving wet tracks on the street that reflected street light in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost meaningful, though she knew it was just water and light and the human tendency to find significance in randomness. Elias Grant stood on their porch for a moment, rain darkening his expensive suit, his face turned up toward the sky as if receiving something, as if the water was washing him in ways that went beyond physical. And then he walked toward the remaining car, a Lincoln town car that had waited while the others departed, and climbed into the back seat with a movement that looked exhausted, that looked like a man who'd given everything today and had nothing left except the drive home and whatever waited for him there in whatever house or apartment or hotel room he'd returned to after his months of street living. The car pulled away, and Maya's street returned to its normal emptiness. The event over, the neighbors' phones going dark, the performance concluded. But inside the Serrano house, nothing had returned to normal. Nothing would return to normal, because something had been disturbed that couldn't be resettled. Some comfortable delusion had been shattered that couldn't be reassembled. And Maya stood with her parents in their living room, feeling like someone had removed a wall she didn't know existed, exposing rooms in herself she'd never had to look at, never had to clean, never had to acknowledge were part of the architecture of who she was. Her father spoke first, his voice rough with emotion and confusion and the particular anger parents feel when their children are hurt or threatened or revealed to be different than they'd imagined, when the narrative they'd constructed about their family encounters facts that don't fit the story. Maya, what exactly happened today? What did you do? The question came not as accusation, but as genuine confusion, as a request for information that would help him make sense of the evening's events, would help him recalibrate his understanding of his daughter and the choices she was capable of making and the person she was becoming as she moved through the painful transition from childhood to whatever came next. Maya sank onto the couch, her legs suddenly unwilling to support her weight, and began talking, not trying to justify or minimize, but simply narrating what had happened with as much honesty as she could manage, describing the man on the courthouse steps, Jordan's comment, Her own laughter, the way she'd felt momentarily elevated by mockery, the casual cruelty that had required no particular effort because it aligned with the world as she'd been taught to see it, where the homeless were problems rather than people, obstacles rather than individuals with stories and dignity and the same fundamental right to exist without being reduced to punchline or symbol or lesson for privileged teenagers learning to exercise the small, vicious powers their position afforded them. Her mother listened with a hand over her mouth, her tears still coming but slower now, and her father's expression cycled through anger and disappointment and something that looked like recognition, like maybe he was remembering his own moments of casual cruelty, his own failures of compassion, his own times when he treated another person's suffering as entertainment or annoyance, rather than as a call to whatever better self he wanted to believe lived beneath his comfortable complicity with systems that rewarded him while crushing others. When Maya finished talking, the house fell silent again. But it was a different silence than before, not the weight of anticipation, but the weight of processing, of three people separately trying to integrate new information into old narratives, trying to reconcile the daughter and child they'd thought they knew with this person who was capable of cruelty, trying to decide what this meant about their family and their values, and whether they'd failed somehow in the raising, or whether this was simply part of growing up, part of the necessary mistakes humans made on the way to becoming whoever they'd eventually become, if they were lucky and willing to learn and brave enough to let themselves be changed by their errors rather than hardened by them. Outside, the rain intensified into a downpour, drumming against the roof with insistent rhythm, and Maya thought about Elias Grant in his town car, about whether he was heading toward shelter or back to the streets, about whether his experiment was truly over, or whether you could ever really return once you'd crossed certain thresholds, once you'd lived in both worlds and learned that the distance between them was maintained by nothing more substantial than collective agreement and historical accident and the accumulated choices of people who'd benefited from inequality without questioning whether benefit and deserving were the same thing. The rain continued, and Maya knew sleep wouldn't come easily tonight, and knew she'd lie in her comfortable bed in her comfortable room, staring at glow-in-the-dark stars and thinking about cardboard and cold and the man whose dignity she'd temporarily stolen before it was restored by limousines and revelation, before the universe showed her exactly what she'd done and who she'd become and left her with the impossible essential work of becoming someone else. Morning arrived in its reluctant Seattle gray, and Maya felt as though she hadn't slept at all, still haunted by dreams that warped her reflection into someone unrecognizable. Moving through her morning routine like a ghost, she avoided responding to Jordan's messages and faced instead the growing weight of her own awakening, an uncomfortable clarity that she'd been wrong about the world and her place in it. Downstairs her parents waited with quiet concern, their unspoken agreement hanging in the air as her mother slid a cup of coffee toward her. They'd taken the day off, deciding together that Maya would stay home from school so they could confront what had happened, what it meant, and how to move forward. The talk that followed stretched for hours. In that long conversation, her parents revealed truths they'd never voiced, her mother's buried memories of a working-class childhood, and the ways comfort had dulled her empathy. Her father's professional deference to the wealthy while overlooking the suffering just outside his office. Maya listened, their confessions blending with her shame until she couldn't bring herself to eat, feeling undeserving of comfort. By midday, they found not a solution, but a shared language for the problem. Her father suggested volunteering, and though Maya resisted, she knew he was right. Together, they researched organizations serving the homeless, overwhelmed by how many people were needed to meet such basic needs. They settled on Grace House, and Patricia, the coordinator, welcomed Maya's hesitant call with a kindness that felt like forgiveness she knew she hadn't earned. The weekend unfolded in a strange limbo as Maya wrestled with her shifting self-understanding. She tried to journal, but couldn't shape her spiraling thoughts into words. Meanwhile, Jordan's increasingly frustrated texts only highlighted the emotional distance between them, a gulf she no longer felt capable or willing to bridge. When Monday came, Maya dressed with anxious care for her first day at Grace House. Her mother drove her in silence, both recognizing that this moment needed action rather than explanation. Standing before the old converted church, Maya felt fear and anticipation mix in her stomach as she stepped inside a space that held warmth, noise, and unvarnished humanity. Patricia greeted her immediately, guiding her through the busy room with eyes that saw both Maya's nerves and her potential. As they walked, Patricia explained the center's philosophy: dignity through presence, not fixing, seeing people rather than sorting them, breaking the habit of treating suffering as something abstract or distant. Orientation was a blend of logistics and lived wisdom. Volunteers sharing how the work had reshaped them, how every guest at Grace House contributed in ways that defied measurement. Maya absorbed everything with the urgency of someone desperate to rebuild herself, asking questions that revealed her inexperience, but also her openness to change. When the orientation ended and the room settled into its rhythm, Maya found herself drawn to an older woman assembling a jigsaw puzzle alone. Asking to join, she was welcomed with a simple instruction: start with the corners, build the frame, let the picture reveal itself. So Maya sat, searching for edges, letting the quiet companionship steady her racing thoughts. As rain traced the windows, Maya worked on the puzzle, feeling that she was also piecing together a truer version of herself. Each small act of attention, each moment of presence felt like practice for a deeper transformation, one built slowly, humbly. One piece at a time, the work ahead would be endless, but for the first time she understood that this was the point, that becoming someone who truly sees the world requires patience, discomfort, and a heart no longer hidden behind privilege, but open to being changed.